So, Mike Vouri. Mike is a good friend, a great researcher, a fellow historian. For many years, you probably knew him as the interpretive ranger at the San Juan Island National Historic Park. He's also the author of several books, a lot of books. The Big War, Outpost of Empire, which is about English camp. And with his wife, Julia, he did both the Friday Harbor and the San Juan Island illustrated history books, which are just a amazing amount of information that way. So I suggest that you look at those. He's currently working on these articles that appear in San Juan Islander. So if you miss those, go to San Juan Islander and you'll find a number of his articles, including why English Camp is named English Camp and so on and so forth. So I think it's really a great source that way. So without further ado, I'm gonna go ahead and turn it over to Mike. I'm gonna mute myself and also turn off my video so you don't have to watch me during the presentation. And I look forward to Mike's presentation. Thank you, Mike, take it away.
So welcome everyone to a rainy evening on San Juan Island. I don't know what it's like. I have some friends tuning in from California. I don't know if you have rain this evening or not, but welcome. And I'm talking to you about the exploration of the San Juan Islands. And you can see charting and naming from 1790 to 1862. And just for a little atmosphere, take a listen to this.
Farewell and adieu to you Spanish ladies, farewell and adieu to you ladies of Spain, for we've received orders to sail for old England. We hope in a short time to see us. We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until we strike soundings in the channel of old England. From Ushant to Scilly, 'tis 35 leagues. We hove our ship to with a wind from southwest, boys. We hove our ship to for to strike soundings clear. 45 fathoms with a one sandy bottom. We square our main yard and up channel did steer. We'll rant and we'll roar like true British sailors. We'll rant and we'll roar all on the salt seas until.
Well, okay. That was Spanish Ladies, which was a very popular Siemens ditty. The first things I'm showing you right now, we're going to be talking about how these guys happen to come out here, how they happen to chart and map, and what brought them here was truly looking for a shortcut. These maps that I'm showing you right now show just how little European map makers knew about the west coast of the Americas in the 18th century. It was truly terra incognita. And of course, one of the things that that they were most interested in was the shortcut between the Pacific and the Atlantic. A shortcut that had been written about going back to Marco Polo, writing about the fabled land of Anaya and the Strait of Anaya that surely rolled across North America and would provide a shortcut to the Orient. And this was a considerable, and there was, I'm told that there is a bit of a delay. Here we go. Here is a cigar box on the cover of which is the fabled Juan de Fuca. We don't know if this guy truly, really existed. He's also known by the Greek Johannes Phocas. He claimed to have been a navigator in the employ of Imperial Spain, and that in 1593 he actually led an expedition and found that fabled Strait of Anian. Now, did he find it? Well, I don't think we'll ever know. I have a friend, Brian Carlson. He owns, and Brian probably knows more about this than anybody I know. And I think it's all subject to speculation, but in the end, this was something that everybody was looking for, including James Cook. Now, here he is, the great navigator, on his third voyage around the Pacific Basin. He had been ordered by the Foreign Office to find this, which is what they called it. And sure enough, he coasted along and got to be about close to the Fuca Pillar, not quite. And they saw a little bight or bay, and they stopped, and a fog rolled in, a storm blew up, it blew them way out to sea, and they ended up on the central west coast of Vancouver Island. And so Cook went back to his cabin, and he jotted down on his map, I think I'm going to call this Cape Flattery, because we flattered ourselves that we might have found the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And well, that just goes to show you that flattery will get you nowhere. And James Cook moved on into history. It was left to a guy named Captain Charles Barkley and the Imperial Eagle to come on to the scene. Barkley nominally discovered and named the Strait of Juan de Fuca in 1787. But he had no interest in east, not with 100 otter pelts in the hold bound for the Macau market. That would be left to explorers from 3 nations who from late spring to early fall strayed into terra incognita. Like the Barkleys, these sailors were not old salts. The captains were in their early 30s, the navigators a mix of veterans and talented novices, but they would follow every shoreline, sound every depth, and journal all they saw, leaving the shapes and names that we know today. Some of the names would change over time. Some would be lost forever. Initially, it was all about determining if Fuca Strait really did cross America. Even then, skeptics such as James Cook and George Vancouver doubted such a voyage had ever been made or that the passage even existed. And when the myth was at last disproved, the scientific process of mapping, cataloging, and naming took over, with a final aim of dividing up the spoils, which nearly led to war in 1859. That was when the San Juan Islands, an afterthought on the various expeditions, became an international sensation. You knew that I was going to get to the pig war, all of you, didn't you? Well, what spurred Spanish to get involved here? That's going to be our group that we're going to talk about. Well, here's what spurred them. The Red Menace, the Russians, yes. Even then, even in the early 18th century, Vitus Bering's voyages 1728 to 30 and 1733 to 41, the Spanish found out that the Russians were sniffing around up here and immediately established a new port just north of Puerto Vallarta in San Blas. And here it is. Here's the remains of the Spanish colonial architecture. They used this port not only to send out voyages of reconnaissance to divine where the Spanish were, but also to send those Franciscan monks up across the border and into California, and the 21 missions was raised in California. And I never forget my field trip to Mission Sonoma. We were taught that that was really a wonderful thing back then, how times have changed. Okay, so from San Blas, the first voyage up north was by Juan Perez. Perez was a navigator. He wasn't an official officer of the Spanish crown, and he sailed around Haida Gwaii, also known as the Queen Charlotte Islands. He made contact with the Haida people, very positive contact, I might add, and then sailed home. The viceroy wasn't very happy about that. So the following year, he dispatched another officer, Bruno Izeda, and Juan Francisco de la Bodega y Cuadra in 1775. Bodega y Cuadra would assume a very prominent role in the Spanish Navy here on the West Coast, and right here, as a matter of fact, in the Pacific Northwest. Of course, when James Cook was on the third voyage, before he met his end in Hawaii, they had been in Nootka Sound, and the local people were trading these wonderful otter pelts with the English seamen. Now, an otter pelt is much richer than a beaver pelt. We're talking about probably 1,000,000 hairs per square inch, as opposed to 1,000 hairs per square inch with a beaver. And that immediately set off the fur rush in the Pacific Northwest, and actually on the entire West. The species was, for all intents and purposes, wiped out in California and very near to being wiped out in the Pacific Northwest. It was a bountiful trade. They were paying huge prices for them in China, most especially in Macau. And the big British trading companies were getting in on it, the South Sea Company, the East India Company, and a company founded by this guy, John Mears, a former Royal Navy officer, who I like to call the troublemaker extraordinaire. He wasn't adverse to telling tales and inflating incidents, and he established probably the first shipyard in the Pacific Northwest in Nootka Sound. And they actually had a ship on the shipping waves. They were building a trading post, and then this guy showed up, Esteban Martinez. He was an officer of the Spanish crown. He came up with a fleet in 1789, sailed into Nootka Sound, found 3 British trading vessels, including one that was captained by a noted trader, James Colnett. Colnett was an irascible kind of guy. Martinez was somewhat megalomaniac and paranoid, and so you can imagine what that combination ended up doing. Oh boy. 3 British ships impounded, the sailors in irons, and the British government absolutely furious and ready to go to war. And there are some really fine artist representations that I'm going to be showing you this evening. Here is another of Martinez's flagship there in Nootka Sound. You can see he had a lot of guns to stick out of the ports. Nobody was going to argue with him. One of the ships that was impounded was the Princesa Real. Another one was called the Santa Maria Gertrudis. In 1789, right after the Nootka affair, 2 pilots, Juan Carrasco and Gonzalo Lopez de Haro, actually sailed up the street of Juan de Fuca almost way to the end, and then came back, but they did not map it. Oh, I made a mistake. It was Jose Maria Narvaez and Juan Carrasco that did so. Sailed all the way up. This ship was only about 48 feet long, a crew of probably about 21 guys. They sailed up. They bumped into the various outlets along the strait and then went out. The following, Manuel Quimper, an officer of the Spanish crown, was giving the commission to not only sail up the Strait of Juan de Fuca, but to map it. And he brought along the gentleman up there in the upper left-hand corner. That's Gonzalo Lopez de Haro. This was Carrasco's second trip up the strait, but as I write here, only Lopez de Haro left his name behind twice, the name of Lope Island and the Haro Strait. By the spring of 1791, the empire was in decay and growing broke. However, the new viceroy of New Spain, Juan Vicente de Güemes Pacheco y Padilla y Orquestidas, the second count of Revillagigedo, all in one breath, ordered Lieutenant Francisco to back up straight to find that Atlantic passage. And failing that, he was to locate a site for a new Spanish base in the rivers put the San Juan archipelago on European maps for the first time, draw praise from colleagues in both navies, and give Eliza more credit than he deserved over posterity. So 1791, Eliza, that's him in the upper right-hand corner, was tasked with exploring the straits aboard the 85-foot, 196-ton packet San Carlos, with veteran pilot Juan Pantoja Iriga as the first maiden pilot. Though only 23, Narvaez was given command of the 42-foot, 32-ton Santa Saturnina, actually the rebuilt Northwest America, the ship that John Mears was building that was taken by the Spanish, renamed Santa Gertrudis, and then disassembled and reassembled under a new name, the Santa Saturnina. Now, those of you that are San Juan Islanders, you're probably wondering, hey, that seems really familiar with Saturn Island in the Gulf Islands, and you're right. That island is named for this vessel. In its fresh configuration, the schooner was ideal for probing inland waterways with 4 sets of oars. While Eliza remained at Puerto de Cordova, that's Esquimalt Bay today, the grunt work of probing the Haro Strait was done by the 3 pilots, commanded by Narvaez, along with apprentice pilot Don Jose Verdia. The officers and 38 sailors and soldiers were apportioned between the schooner and the San Carlos longboat, which could also be rigged for sail. On their return a few days later, Eliza named the archipelago Isla y Archipelago de San Juan. Eliza moved on to a fresh anchorage at Puerto de Quadra, or Discovery, a few days later. This was June 24th. From there, Narvaez, Carrasco, and Verdia rowed directly toward Cattle Pass between San Juan and Lopez, but chose not to enter there as a broader channel beckoned to the east. Perhaps sensing a connection with the northern mouth, they also named this pass Boca de Orcasides. As you can see on this particular illustration, I'm going to open it up just a little bit. You can see the outline of the San Juan Islands. I like to say that this looks like a pork chop. And the Spanish named those 2 outlets that you see. There's the one on the upper right of the pork chop and the one on the bottom left. Those are both Boca de Orcasides de Isla de San Juan Island. So when Narvaez is approaching the Boca de Orcasides on the southern end, he decides he doesn't want to go through it. And he heads off to the right. And they're Boca de Fidalgo, and soon realized that they're in an extensive channel, which required renaming. And they called it the Canal de Fidalgo, which is today's Rosario Strait. Along the way, they anchored in Ship Harbor, which is our ferry port for the Washington Ferry in Anacortes, and named it Isla de Fidalgo. The vessels also may have rowed through Deception Pass, which they called Boca de Flan. So the voyage is over. They do some magnificent charts, including the one that you just saw. The archipelago was officially named. Now, there are some that believe that it was named for Revillagigedo because his first name was Juan. The problem is that while the Count was possibly the greatest viceroy New Spain ever had, he was by no means a saint. True, san or santa can merely mean sacred, but was he most holy? The historian Richard Blumenthal and other experts in the field suggest that Eliza may have named the archipelago San Juan because June 24th celebrates St. John the Baptist. This was a little more elevated than naming a place for rocks or ducks, but the Samish called San Juan Island Laquamesh, for appear or come down. a Garden of Eden in the Samish and Lummi origin story. We all know it's a special place. The following year, the British arrive. George Vancouver to sea for over a year already, having left England, given the charter to find a Northwest Passage and also to settle the Nootka controversy. He was to meet with the representative of the Spanish crown in Nootka Sound. And along the way, he charted the west coast of Australia. He did some charting around Fiji, called in Hawaii, and finally ended up at the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca in early May of 1792. He had been a midshipman under James Cook. And while he was a midshipman on the third voyage, the master of one of the vessels was William Bligh, a sailing master. It's not really a commissioned officer, it's more like a non-commissioned officer, a step up from a midshipman. And Vancouver had been cognizant that Bligh had encountered a mutiny on board the Bounty. And so he used extreme disciplinary measures with his crew and was not the most popular guy by the time they had arrived here on the west coast of North America. In fact, one of the reasons why there were two vessels instead of one on this particular voyage was because of the Bounty mutiny. So Vancouver arrives in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. He thinks he's the first to explore the northern straits. In fact, he gets in a big argument with Robert Gray, an American merchant captain, right around Tatoosh, where you turn into the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And Gray tells him that he hasn't been very far up the straits. Vancouver is bound and determined that he's going to go there, so he foregoes the opportunity to discover the Columbia River and sails up the Strait of Juan de Fuca, thinking he's in virgin territory. He arrived and he immediately starts naming everything that he sees. And of course, he didn't have any problems renaming features because he hadn't thought the Spanish had been here. The Spanish had named this magnificent mountain Sierras Nevadas de San Antonio. Vancouver decided it should be Mount Rainier in honor of the guy in the upper left-hand corner, Rear Admiral Peter Rainier. And are we glad today that he did that? You can see a survey signal on the right-hand corner of the engraving, but it's not really a survey signal. European survey signals looked an awful lot like this, but the Coast Salish people had another use for them, and I'll show you in just a second. Here it is. You can see 4 of them there. This is at Port Townsend. And the Coast Salish people would rig these things up and rig nets because they were flyways for ducks. It was a great way to capture ducks. Now you can see there's 2 longboats of Vancouver's voyage, and one of the people in the longboat is taking a reading on shore. Believe it or not, this is a way that you also take a reading from a signal tower on shore if you're out in a longboat and doing a hydrographic survey, which threw me this time I saw it. But if you read Vancouver's journals, that's what those towers were. Now, Vancouver decided that exploration on the northwest coast could only be accomplished by longboat, under oars, or sail. The labyrinth of islands, channels, and inlets that captains and crew had encountered was akin to wandering through a garden maze with 8-foot hedges. It was blind and treacherous, and the readings from the ships were inaccurate. So here's what they were doing. This is a detail from the end product that was done with Vancouver's voyage. And as you can see, it was quite extensive all the way up to the head. And please note on here, I'll blow it up just a little bit. You can see Admiralty Inlet at the very top, the mouth of Puget Sound, but you can see Admiralty Inlet goes all the way down to the Tacoma Narrows. And Puget Sound is south of the Tacoma Narrows, named for Peter Puget, one of Vancouver's officers. Vancouver didn't have any problem seeking patronage. For example, Rear Admiral Peter Rayner Canal and Mount Hood, named for Admiral Hood. But he also took care to praise his officers by naming features after them. It was around 5 p.m. on May 18, 1792, ebb tide boiling and the wind freshening in the narrow rocky confines of Cattle Pass. Not a happy prospect for HMS Chatham at 65 feet and 131 tons. The ship's cutter guided both craft through, quote, a passage of a mile in width, close to the larboard rocky island as we entered. It was the first European entry into the San Juan Islands. Now, this had happened. Vancouver had decided to split up the expedition. He headed up Puget Sound and sent William Broughton and the Chatham over across the Strait of Juan de Fuca and through the pass. He wanted him to explore the archipelago. Now, Broughton, unlike Narvaez the year before, decided to chance the Boca de Orcasides. They didn't know that that's what Narvaez had called it, but he decided to do this particular passage rather than the wider one further to the east, which would be Rosario Strait. He was 29 years old at the time. This painting was done later in life. His logs are lamentably spare. They mainly address the ship movements, the strong tidal currents of which any island mariner is aware today. The weather, windy yet salubrious. This is good May, June weather. We have a pretty good idea of his anchorages from the soundings taken to ensure a secure set on the bottom. For details, we must rely on the brief shore excursions of people such as ship's clerk Edward Bell, 21, whose anonymous journal was not credited to him until the 20th century. He was struck by, quote, soil so rich, the grass in several parts grew to man height. But there was a guy, and all of you natural know this. This is Archibald Menzies. Menzies was a little more verbose when it came to the San Juans and very excited about the plant life, the flora and the fauna that he saw in the islands. To quote, the shores were almost everywhere steep, rugged, and cliffy, which landing difficult, and the woods were in many places equally difficult of access from the rocky cliffs and chasms with which they abounded. But I was not at all displeased at the change in general ruggedness of the surface of the country, as it produced a pleasing variety in the objects of my pursuit, added considerably to my cattle plants. Anyway, they get right to the So while Vancouver was away, here's what happened. They do about a 3-day reconnaissance of the San Juans. They do about 32 different signals around the islands. They managed to chart the inner passages, and they managed to divine that Spanish pork chop. They start, the islands themselves begin to take shape on the rough charts of the British. So Broughton meets Vancouver up Puget Sound, and then both vessels turn and sail out Admiralty Inlet and start up toward the Georgia Strait. And Vancouver sets on ahead and leaves Broughton in command, not only of the Chatham, but HMS Discovery. Remember, they were doing all of this by longboat. By the time their particular survey was over here, they would survey 1,700 miles of coastline, and altogether with the windings in and out, it would amount to about 10,000 miles. So Broughton is waiting for Vancouver, and Joseph Whidbey comes back from divining that Whidbey Island was truly an island, which is why it was given his name. And he reports to Broughton that he sees 2 other European vessels. So Broughton gets pretty excited about this. He weighs anchor in the Chatham and goes out to find out who they are. And this is who they are: the Sutil and the Mexicana, 2 Spanish sloops, each 46 feet long, with a crew of 17. I mean, they were literally sleeping on top of each other. They'd been dispatched from Acapulco in March to expand on Eliza's expedition of the year before. And as with Vancouver, they'd been ordered by the Viceroy to hunt for the Northwest Passage, but not to tell anybody about it. There were Captains Dionisio Alcalá Galeano of the Sutil and Captain Gaetano Valdez, second in command aboard the Mexicana. They had sailed up from Nootka on June 5th and anchored off the tip of Lopez before turning up Rosario Strait. That handsome guy on the left lost that head at the Battle of Trafalgar. That's right, taken off by a solid shot. Very sad story. Pretty great guy. They got along with the British just fine. There had been an agreement to survey together, but the 2 Spanish vessels just couldn't keep up with the British ships, and they fell by the wayside. But this is Galeano's chart. Galeano, starting from Nootka Sound, about halfway up Vancouver Island, they sailed all the way around the island, and this is the chart that they did from their particular voyage. Now, they did trade with the British, and I could never understand why their San Juan Island still looks like a pork chop when you compare what the British chart looked like. Now, Vancouver is given credit for being the first guy to circumnavigate Vancouver Island, but he didn't really do it, because look at the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This is where Vancouver started. He started from that particular point and went all the way around, whereas Galeano and Valdez started and ended up where they started. So they truly circumnavigated it. Let's hear it for Spain. So here is Vancouver's finished chart. This particular version of the chart, and there was a lot more to be seen. This is a folio number 5. This was done back in England by Joseph Baker. It was published in 1798, and you can see it is truly a remarkable document. And you can see, oops, gosh, sorry about that. You can see the San Juan Islands. In fact, we're going to get into a nice close-up. Now, when Vancouver came back from his voyage and rejoined Broughton, he wrote this in his log: "During my absence, the boats of the Discovery and Chatham had been employed in attempting to gain some further knowledge of the numerous islands we passed by on our arrival in this bay. But they were found so abundantly dispersed as to preclude any correct examination without having sufficient of the purpose." Again, they get to the point. The world would have its first glimpse of the San Juan Islands channels and individual islands when Lieutenant Joseph Baker's folio sheet number 5 was published in 1798. But not one name was assigned to any island, channel, or feature, save for Cypress Island, Strawberry Bay, and the Canal de Hierro, a Spanish name, incorrectly spelled. Oh, by the way, as they were sailing around the tip of Vancouver Island, the Discovery ran aground, but fortunately, she floated. no European returned to the San Juan Islands. When I include the American U.S. expedition, which was launched by the United States government in 1838 to make accurate charts of all doubtful islands and shoals and commercial shipping routes throughout the Pacific Basin, as well as to observe and record plant and animal life and natural phenomenon. By the time they arrived in the Strait of Juan de Fuca in April 1841, they'd been at sea for 3 years, mapped a score of Pacific Island groups, climbed Mauna Loa on Hawaii, and verified that the Antarctic was a continent. In my One Islander story, I ran a flattering picture of Charles Wilkes. He wasn't particularly loved by his crews either. In fact, they called him the stormy petrel. The petrel is that seabird that pecks the eyes out of people that are in lifeboats. When the XX arrived here, it first traced George Vancouver's steps to Discovery Bay and thence up Puget Sound. In the process, Expedition Commander Charles Wilkes named whatever Vancouver missed and renamed a few features already on the map. By then, the United States and Great Britain were haggling and earning possession of the Oregon country, and Wilkes was not only taking the lay of the land, but changing it as well. To his mind, the San Juans provided one of those blank canvases. Remember, the Spanish thought the archipelago was a single island, and the British had not bothered to name anything except for the Strait of Georgia. This man looking at on the left was a product from the Wilkes expedition. And as you can see, he does sort of capture the shapes of the San Juan Islands. So Wilkes was busy. They sailed up Puget Sound first, retracing Vancouver steps. He went overland down to Fort Vancouver. Then he came over again, he joined the rest of the expedition right around where Port Townsend is today. And then on July 28th, they set off on a blustery afternoon with 7 longboats when, quote, the tide was found to be running strong ebb against the wind, producing a very high sea, which made the passage at times perilous. The robust waves made a clean breach across the boat, and one craft lost a mast before thoroughly soaked crews managed to pull into a small bight at dusk along the southwest coast of San Juan Island. The men built a fire, dried out their clothes, and made camp at the foot of rocky bluffs. Now, I'm speculating it could be any one of those bights from South Beach west around to Hannah Heights. They only spent about 2.5 days surveying in the San Juans. One of their vessels, the SS Peacock, crossing over Columbia River Bar. As a consequence, the attenuated survey resulted in a chart only slightly less crude than the Spanish or British editions. For example, a U.S. Coast Survey chart maker, George Davidson, pointed out, Lopez Island is as unlike itself as anything can be, and you'll see that in a moment. Of course, they had an expedition artist along, which did this canoe of quote-unquote Oregon Indians. Remember, this was all Oregon in those days. And they reported there was one particular time, I think they were probably beached near Sound. They had run into a group of Clallams, and the Clallams said, look out, there's some more canoes coming, we better run. They figured that these were Lekwatock or perhaps Haida or another northern group coming down to raid. But in the end, it just ended up being some Samish who may have been armed, but they also had 2 or 3 carcasses of deer, which they exchanged for 5 charges of powder and ball each. They were already armed. I speculate they were probably Hudson Bay guns. And here is Wilkes' chart of ones. And there is Lopez, looking not much like itself. Take a look at the names of some of these inner channels: Macedonian Crescent, Frolic Straits, Guerriere Bay. Now, Charles Wilkes decided to call the San Juan Islands the Navy Archipelago. You have Rogers Island. And he named those inner passages after British warships that had been captured or sunk by American warships in the War of 1812, going clockwise, Little Carrier and Macedonian. And of course, two of our greatest heroes of the War of 1812, Johnston Blakely on the left and Stephen Decatur on the right. Now, Wilkes leaves, and about 5 years later, the British arrive again. Now, they arrived with specific direction from Sir Francis Beaufort of the British Hydrography Department. He was telling them in terms of naming, on the Mars, name stamped upon a place by the first discoverer should be held sacred by the common consent of all nations and better described by the character of the place or native names. This was direction now from the Admiralty. Francis Beaufort, same guy that you know of the Beaufort scale for measuring storms at sea. Now, an able survey and proven expedition leader, Captain Henry Kellett, RN, has been credited with sweeping in and righting the taxonomic wrongs by erasing Wilkes charts and restoring Spanish names to the island group. The trouble with this tale is that Kellett never saw Charles Wilkes' map before he left England in 1845, and no such chart was evident during the Treaty of Oregon negotiations that same year. In fact, the British government did not learn of the Navy Archipelago until presented with a chart in November 1848. It was backdated to 1841 in the title block, and that's what's thrown a lot of writers and some historians even over the years. So Kellett took the names on his own from the directions given to him by Francis Beaufort and honored the first discoverers. And so Orcas was drawn from Boca de Orcasitas, San Juan Island from the Isla, the archipelago, and Lopez from the pilot Gonzalo Lopez Haro. You can see Kellett Bluff on Henry Island, named for Henry Kellett. Henry Island, incidentally, was named for Charles Wilkes' nephew, Wilkes Henry, who was killed on the beach in a ruckus with Fiji Islanders. And here is Kellett's map, and you can see some of the names. This map was updated, but it is basically Kellett's map. So Kellett goes to the Arctic, and while he's in the Arctic, he takes HMS Herald. He was only here one season, 1846. He takes HMS Herald up to the Arctic through the Bering Strait, and then returns by way of Baffin Bay in another ship, HMS Resolute, in 1852. And the Resolute is on the left in this painting. And because she was iced in, it prompted one of his officers, Richard Roach, Lieutenant Richard Roach, to pioneer the European use of dog sledges for exploration and rescue. This was cut short when he accidentally shot himself in the leg. Roach made an impression on one man, Commander George H. Richards of HMS Assistance, so much so that he named him a name for him, the harbor on the north end of San Juan Island. By the way, Richard Roach was not a lieutenant in the Royal Marines. He did not pioneer lime manufacturing. He was an officer in the Royal Navy with a bum leg. Okay, so Richard also held the distinction of logging more than 2,000 miles in sleds pulled by men and dogs, and was promoted to captain soon after returning to England. He was eventually assigned command of the steam survey ship HMS Plumper. His mission was to assist in the water boundary and also to survey, and he brought his wife along. That's his wife there in the right-hand picture, Mary Richards. And there is the sled dog pioneer, Richard Roach. And I believe this is him on looking toward the stern of HMS Satellite. Here is Richard's map of San Juan Island. And of course, Richards honored a lot of Wilkes names, including Brown Island, which was named for the instrument maker, John G. Brown. Take a look at this, the Royal Marine Camp, not English camp, not British camp, Royal Marine Camp. Here's Richard's map of San Juan Island. You can see the Hudson's Bay Company farm, the Flagstaff. There's no Army camp left. And somebody misspelled prairie. Here is HMS Plumper doing the hydrographic survey. Take a look at the signal tower right there, very much like those Indian towers. The British were joined in surveying the islands by the United States government with the U.S. Coast Survey. That is the U.S. Coast Survey ship active on the right, which I've lectured about many times at the library. On the left is HMS Satellite. That would be Richard Roach's ship, where he was the third lieutenant. The American surveyors, George Davidson and James Alden, did the lion's share of the work on the west coast of the United States, but also in the San Juan Islands. By the way, Alden is a direct descendant of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins of Mayflower fame, and he was here with Charles Wilkes during the U.S. exploring expedition. Of course, there were ways that they do it. I won't go into detail. They used the zenith telescope. They used, for the topographic survey and the hydrographic survey, they surveyed from signal towers, and they used a plane table when they were doing the topographic surveys. All this equipment weighed about 300 pounds. Now checking the GPS on your iPhone when you're your hikes with the Gaia app. And here they are in the observatory. You can see they were out, sometimes they were out for as long as 30, 40 days waiting for the clouds to push off or for the smoke to clear so they could take an astronomical reading. That must be why their beards are so long. Here's the U.S. Coast Survey's first San Juan Islands chart. This was done from the 1853 season. And this chart is notable for this one detail. Take a look at the Indian villages on the west coast of San Juan Island. You can see there's Rocky Bay, which we now call False Bay. This was fishing season. Remember, any surveyor, the Spanish, the British, the Americans, they always came during salubrious weather, which would be spring, summer, fall. Here is the completed triangulation map that was done to determine the distances between points of land. This was done by both the British and the Americans, but this happens to be the Americans' map. If you look at San Juan Island, it's kind of crude. Maybe they used Charles Wilkes' map, who knows? But if you look at the survey points today, hiking at American camp. Here is a completed German map. This was a German map making company. They made maps for throughout the Western world. And you can see that they're hanging on to Douglas Channel, which was one of Richard's names. The Americans called it President's Channel. And you can see that channel right there. And this map looks pretty much like the San Juan Islands we know today. There is a good blend of the names that Wilkes picked: Shaw, Blakely, Decatur. There's also San Juan, Lopez, Orcas. Those are from Kellett, and of course Cyprus, which was the one that was named by George Fair. Just some views of the Coast Survey steamer active. Here she is off Port Townsend. Remember the duck towers? Here it is again. Deception Pass. That is a longboat. They're throwing out a lead. Harrow Strait. These paintings were done by James Madison Alden, the nephew of James Alden. The Rosario Strait, that's Mount Constitution in the background. Remember, all of these particular expeditions, Spanish, British, American, had artists along as well as the chart makers because, hey, we want to know what it looks like back home. Here is James Madison Alden's view of Griffin Bay. It was called Ontario Roads. They were holding on to the War of 1812 name. But look here. Here is the only known view of San Juan Village, the first community on San Juan Island. And those of you that read my last story about the cannon in the San Juan Islander will note the naval gun sitting there just below the village. And here's the same scene today. Esquimalt Harbor with HMS Satellite and the U.S. Coast Survey steamer active at anchor. This would eventually become a Royal Navy and eventually Royal Canadian Navy base. So George Richard switched vessels in 1860. The Plumper was tired and worn out, and they gave him the paddle wheel steamer Hecate. And boy, she was a really good ship. And then they ran her onto the rocks right around Cape Flattery. Fortunately, she didn't sink and went on to her career here and took Captain Richards home. And he produced this amazing chart of the San Juan Islands. One final view. Here's the U.S. Coast Survey steamer active. It's the only known photograph of this where you can see her side wheel. She's at Nanaimo picking up coal. And here is my last slide. And this collage was done by Doug McCutcheon of the San Juan County Land Band. The top photo taken by John Gilbert of the United States Coast Survey when they returned here, starting in 1894. And he, because we had photography all of a sudden, you didn't have to do a painting. And Gilbert was quite the photographer. He exhaustively photographed the San Juan Islands. And then Doug came along in his wake a few years ago and matched every single view. So kudos to Doug McCutcheon here tonight. I thank you very much for your attention. It's really sure to talk with you this evening. And I've been here some sources that I've used for the stories and also for the presentation. I'd like to shout out again to Steve, terrific views. I have a bit of history. You can visit their websites. They'll be happy to send you if you want. And if you'd like a copy of this, I'll make sure that Boyd Pratt gets it. And this concludes my portion of the evening. Thank you again very much.
Well, thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it. And okay, we're back to Hollywood Squares now. And I'm going to go ahead and I don't see any questions in the chat box right now, but does anybody have any questions they'd like to do their, raise their virtual hand or and Mike, I think you need to get out of your sharing screen again.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, here I am. Here I am.
Whoa, he actually has a picture. Mike, thank you very much.
All right.
What a thorough,
Oh, I see some friends.
what a thorough exploration of the islands. And And yes, you do see a lot of your friends there. Do any of your friends have any questions? I noticed that Rebecca Smith is saying, always love Mike's easy conversational style. I couldn't agree more. So you must have said it all, Mike. I don't know.
I guess I did. I guess I pretty much exhausted the topic. It was a lot of fun to do this work. I'd like to do a shout out to a guy named Richard Blumenthal. He's a historian. He lives up Puget Sound. You'll notice I say up Puget Sound rather than down Puget Sound because we're kind of prisoners of the Rand McNally atlas. We when we're driving to Seattle, we say, "Well, I'm driving down to Seattle." Well, if you were a mariner in the mid 19th century, you would say, "I'm going up to Olympia, the territorial capital." I know when I first started doing research, and I was reading one of Silas Casey's letters, and he said he was at Fort Steilacoom, which is south of Tacoma, and he said that he was going down to Port Townsend, and I thought, what? I turned the map around, and Dr. Wayne Subtle said, if you want to get away from that and you want to get into the mind of a mariner, the next time you look at a map, turn it sideways and approach the coast and the waterways, like the 18th and 19th century mariners did. That way they would say, well, I'm going up here, I'm going up there, or over there.
So I have a question for you, Mike, and this is, as you know, dear to my heart. A number of your illustrations, including that wonderful one of a canoe, show native vessels. Have you had a chance to actually look at a lot of those and see the various types? I'm just curious.
Well, I know once, we have that wonderful photograph of Kanaka Bay that I've used on numerous occasions that show a whole variety of Northwest Coast and Coast Salish canoes. And I remember one of them, I've never forgotten this, Boyd told me, well, there's the Model T of the Coast Salish canoes. And I think the one that was captured by the U.S. exploring expeditions was definitely a Coast Salish canoe. I don't know if it was a salt chuck, but it was pretty exciting. And you can see the same canoes, the same ones that were in Wilkes's journals. Those are in the painting that William McMurtry did of the satellite and the active on Bellingham Bay. Same canoes, if you look closely. I have an engraving on my wall here. I'm not gonna take my iPad up there and throw it on the wall because I don't want anybody to get sick. But it shows bidarki rather than canoes, the Inuit bidarki, which is kind of fun.
Okay, Mike, I have a question in the chat this is from Perrin Columna, and he's asking you, Mike, what are the Native American names still in place in the Salish Sea? And also, how was Kanaka Bay named?
How old was that?
I'm sorry, say it again.
I didn't get the last part of the question.
The first part was, are there any Native American names in the Salish Sea that are left? And the second was, how was Kanaka Bay named?
Kanaka Bay was named by the U.S. Coast Survey because there was a Hawaiian village located there on the bay. That's what I've been given to understand. It's Kanaka Bay is just north of False Bay on the island. In terms of the Salish Sea, there aren't too many native names in the Salish Sea. Unfortunately, there are more native names or First Nations names, I want to say, in Canada than there are in the United States. I mean, Lummi Island, of course, is named for the Lummi people. Samish Island for the Samish people. I can probably, off the top of my head, that's what I can tell you. I did want to read you something. You know, we're talking about names. With all the naming going on, what about the last sentence of Francis Beaufort's policy concerning names? The one about using native names whenever possible. This did not happen in the San Juan Islands. Kellett, Wood, and Alden were silent about their choices, and we know all about Wilkes. Richards, the dominant namer and arbiter of names in the region, did opine that indigenous people did not, quote unquote, really name anything, unquote, beyond cursory descriptions of similar places, such as, quote unquote, far away for mountain. We now know that this is patently ridiculous. But Richards and his fellows could not differentiate between multiple dialects, let alone understand and pronounce the words. And those languages were decades from being written. As you would expect, Richards offered no apologies. Bryce Wood, author of the San Juan Coastal Place Names, an excellent book written in 1980. Bryce Wood was a professor. It's a brilliant book. You can find, there's 2 copies in the San Juan Island Library. He suggests that the reason Richards did not apply Indian names here, as he did on Vancouver Island, is because there were no permanent residents, quote unquote, in the islands at the time. Quote, the Indians had names for places, he writes, but no effort was made to seek them out. So I think that's probably definitely a cultural problem, a cultural gulf there.
Thank you. And Perrin says, thank you very much, Mike, for answering that. Gart Sundstrom had a question to me, and that is how did you get all these maps, Mike? I mean, where do all these come from? Is there like a single source, or how do you get at this?
Well, believe it or not, you have these maps at your fingertips online if you want to look at them. It's amazing. For the Wilkes map that I showed you, that last Wilkes map, that came from NOAA on their website. And also it's on the Smithsonian website. In fact, there's a better copy of it on the Smithsonian website because as we know, most of us who know this, who've studied this, we know that the collections from the Wilkes expedition form the core of the Smithsonian Institution collections. And so the Smithsonian has a tremendous website, including the illustrations and the maps, and you can find them all there. Also, Washington State University has an excellent website of pioneer maps from the period, and you can get them in pretty good shape. And also the University of Washington, and also the Online Archive of California. There is an abundance of sources for everyone out there. But I want to do a shout out to Steve Buck. I ran into Steve Buck at the Historical Museum last summer, not this past summer, but the summer before last. And he had a rolled up map with him. And I said, geez, what do you got, Steve? And he opened it up and it was Wilkes' map of the San Juan Islands. And I was just, boy, I was really taken with that. And Steve says, well, you can have it. He handed it to me. So what I did is I rolled it out and I flattened it, put weights around it, and then I took a picture of it for you. So anyway, thanks,
That's
Steve.
great. So are any other questions or comments or? Well, I don't see any. So Mike, I wanted to thank you so much. It's I just love your talks and you're just such a wealth of information. So thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad.
Thank you, everybody. It's really great to see all my friends out there, family and friends that tuned in. It's good to see y'all. Lots of love, everybody.
Yeah, I will add that this, as I said, this is being recorded and